And so to the main event. I'm joined now by the SNP leader and Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. Welcome, Nicola Sturgeon.
Thank you very much.
It seems very likely now the Prime Minister will bring back some kind of deal to the House of Commons. In those circumstances, what will the 35 SNP MPs do?
Well, we've always said our bottom line is membership of the single market and the customs union. I cannot envisage the SNP MPs voting for something that doesn't contain that. Don't forget, Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU.
And it's very hard to imagine Theresa May coming back with that kind of deal. So it looks almost inevitable that your MPs will vote against what she brings back.
At this stage, I would say that is the case, but let's wait and see what happens. I don't think, sitting here right now, we can rule out a no deal, and that would be extremely damaging for everybody. But what I suspect right now looks most likely is a cobbled-together agreement around the withdrawal issues, including the Northern Ireland backstop, but that is only achieved by fudging all of the issues about the future relationship. So it will be the kind of waffle and fudge. So we will have what some people have been calling a blind Brexit, where the House of Commons is asked to effectively rubber stamp the UK leaving the EU without anybody having any idea what the future relationship is going to look like. And I think that is almost as unacceptable as no deal at all, because it would continue all of the uncertainty that businesses and others are suffering right now. Throw all of the issues that have been incapable of resolution over the past 2 years into the long grass, and the cliff edge we are facing now would simply be faced again towards the end of 2020. So I would find it inconceivable that the House of Commons could give the go-ahead to something like that. We'll
come on to that in just a second. What would no deal mean? You mentioned it a few times. What would no deal mean for Scotland?
Well, no deal for Scotland would mean all of the same horrific things that it would mean for the rest of the UK. You know, we have heard over recent weeks talks about medicines shortages, food shortages, aeroplanes being grounded, gridlock at ports. That is unthinkable. And, you know, I really do think at this late stage, whatever Theresa May brings back or doesn't bring back, there must be a real determination on the part of all political parties to avoid that happening. I've said in the last couple of weeks that if that means requesting an extension to Article 50, that should be on the table. But what I think is really important is that the House of Commons and the country as a whole really doesn't allow itself to get into the position of fire or frying pan, where Theresa May says, well, the deal I've brought back is as good as I can do. Nobody really knows what the future relationship is going to be like. It's outside the single market and customs union, but you've got to accept that because there's no deal.
That is the problem that your MPs have.
Well, but our MPs, if we're in that situation, our MPs will try to bring forward proposals to stay in the single market and the customs union. We will push for the extension of Article. Well, we've heard that for 2 years. I accept that has been the case for the last 2 years. But if people start to face the reality of that precipice of a no deal, then I do think sensible options have to come back on the table.
You've got, I think, £27 million to prepare for no deal. What kind of things have you been spending the money on? Well,
we're preparing right across all of the responsibilities of the Scottish Government as well as we possibly can. So the health...
Just give people watching a few concrete examples.
Well, for example, the Health Secretary is looking at how we, try to ensure that we don't face immediate medicines shortages. We are, talking to and working with businesses in different sectors across the economy. And we will continue to do that, and we absolutely accept the responsibilities we've got here. But the UK Government, the Prime Minister, is in the driving seat of this, and it's trying to prepare for things almost with one or perhaps two hands tied behind our back.
But knowing what Scotland would be facing in the event of no deal, your MPs would still vote against a deal.
No, I don't accept that is the choice that the House of Commons...
Well,
but that, we simply cannot have a situation which I described a moment ago as fire or frying pan. I think in those circumstances, MPs of all parties, sensible MPs of all parties, should come together and look at the alternatives. No doubt the calls for a second referendum would grow in those circumstances, and I've said before we would not stand in the way of a second referendum, the so-called people's vote. I think the SNP MPs would undoubtedly vote for
they would.
That
That's
proposition.
A very important moment, because they are a very important bloc in the House of Commons.
We would, of course, want to talk to people about how we ensure that Scotland doesn't end up in the same position all over again, where we voted to remain in the EU but find ourselves facing exit completely against our will. But the important point here is that the country... Scotland or the UK as a whole can't find itself in the situation where it's a really bad outcome or a worse outcome. There has to be space for common sense and calm consideration of the best outcome.
So let's be absolutely clear. If there is a vote for another Brexit-related referendum across the UK, the SNP MPs will vote for it.
I would expect the SNP MPs to vote for that if that comes to a vote in the House of Commons.
And as you say, the danger, I suppose, for the SNP is that you get the same kind of result as we had last time. Scotland votes to stay inside the EU, England votes the other way, most of it, and Scotland is then, in your view, ignored. So how can you get some kind of guarantee that you get another independence referendum?
We'll look at all options around that. But, of course, the fundamental issue here for Scotland is that the reason we can have change like this imposed on us against our will is that we're not an independent country in charge of our own destiny. So a second EU referendum, I think the case for that, the arguments for that are understandable, but we have to be absolutely clear it's not the real solution to the fundamental problem Scotland finds itself in, where our voice is not heard, not just on the vote in 2016, but since the vote in 2016, you know, our call for sensible compromise options have been cast aside. The UK government's even taken the Scottish government to court over trying to protect the powers of the Scottish Parliament. If
you're looking for some kind of political guarantees in that circumstance, there is nobody who can give it to you, is there? I mean, Theresa May can't and won't. Jeremy Corbyn.
That's why I'm being pretty frank, that while SNP MPs may well vote for that proposition, it's not the fundamental solution to Scotland's problem. Now, we can try to find ways. Before the 2016 referendum, I put forward the proposal for the double lock, where the UK could only leave the EU if all 4 of the countries of the UK voted for that.
That was briskly rejected by London.
But the more these compromise options that are put forward by the SNP or the Scottish Government are, to use your term, briskly rejected, the more, I guess, and we see it in opinion polls today, the more people in Scotland will conclude that the only option here is actually to take our future into our own hands and become independent.
Well, let's turn to that directly. A big march in Edinburgh yesterday.
Yeah, huge.
Polls suggesting that if we have a no-deal Brexit in particular, Scotland will then turn towards independence and you'll get the kind of majority you want. Lots of folk at your conference today are hoping to hear you say, do you know what, I can tell you that immediately after Brexit we're going to go for a second referendum. You've never quite said that.
No, I haven't said that, because what I have said, and I will stick to this, is that I will set out what I think the next steps are when we are at the end of this phase of negotiations. Now, why is that?
What does this phase mean?
Well, when Theresa May comes back and says, I've got the deal, we will judge that.
So at that point you will say what you're going to do on a second independence referendum?
Previously I would have thought, previously Theresa May would have said that was October. It looks as if it might be November. I will set out my views on the next step at that stage. Why is that timescale important? Because whether I like it or not, or whether anybody likes it or not, the future EU-UK relationship is the context in which Scotland would decide that question of independence. So it will shape some of the answers to questions people have. So it's great for me to be sitting here on the first day of my party conference with polls, a number of polls today showing support for independence rising. You've already mentioned the quite extraordinary demonstration of support on the streets of Edinburgh yesterday. That's a happy position for an independence-supporting SNP leader to be in. But, of course, I think it's important to get the timing right, not just for self-interested reasons. We want to have that decision when we've got the best chance of winning it, but out of respect to the decision that we will be asking people to make.
And to be absolutely crystal clear, before Christmas, you will tell people what the timing is for a second independence
I will set out my views on the next steps at that stage. If that's when Theresa May comes back with the deal and everything...
So it could be later this month that we hear?
Well, I'm not in charge of that, so I'm judging. So it could be later this month, it could be November, it could be December. But that's what I mean, just to be crystal clear about the end of this phase of negotiations.
Now, for a second independence referendum, do you accept that you have to have resolved issues like the Scottish currency and whether or not you want to go back into the EU afterwards before that happens?
Before we ask people to vote again for independence, of course.
A lot of work to do.
Yes, although we're making progress, as the polls show, but I readily accept that in order to be confident of persuading a majority of people that independence is the best future for Scotland, then yes, we still have work to do on all of these questions. Just as, and one of the great contrasts, of course, between the 2014 referendum and the 2016 EU referendum was that in 2016 there was a slogan or a lie on the side of a bus. In 2014 we had a white paper, a detailed proposition that some people disagreed with, others agreed with, but that detail was there. And I think whenever people are asked to make a decision of that magnitude, then they deserve that detail and that frankness.
A very simple, sweeping question. Do you think that Brexit makes Scottish independence almost inevitable?
I think Scottish independence will happen. So if you're asking me to use the term inevitable, I guess, yes, I would use that. I think we're on a journey that will end with independence. I think Brexit brings the issues around this very sharply into focus. That democratic deficit that we in the last 2 years, where Scotland, 62% of people in Scotland voted to remain in the EU, and yet in, 100, almost, under 200 days, we're going to face exit from the EU. It's hard to think of a better illustration of that democratic deficit than that.
Let's look a little bit further forward down the line to an independent Scotland. You set up a Scottish Growth Commission. And, of course, Scotland has a much bigger public deficit problem than England has at the moment, 8% to, roughly speaking, 2%. And your own Growth Commission said that to get Scottish public finances in order, that would mean a 4% squeeze over the next 10 years. That's going to feel to a lot of Scots like you vote for independence, you have another 10 years of Scottish austerity. Well,
just let me be clear about what the Scottish Growth Commission actually said. It said that a future Scottish government in an independent Scotland should explicitly and firmly reject the austerity approach that we've seen in the last few years. We should grow public expenditure in real terms. We should have fiscal rules, but we should not become a prisoner of those fiscal rules. We should put growing the economy and growing public spending as part of that. But it did also talk about a 4% squeeze, didn't it? It talked about growing public spending explicitly. The other point I think that is really important here is you talk about Scotland's fiscal position and how that is relative to the rest of the UK. That's a feature of how we are governed right now. It's not a reflection of what life would be in an independent Scotland. Part of the argument for independence is to have the powers to grow our economy faster and more sustainably, to grow the wealth of the country and to steward that wealth in the interests of everybody across the country.
There's an old phrase, why look in the crystal ball where you can read the history book? You've been in power for 11 years now. Why is it that after 11 years, Scottish confidence and support for Scottish public services is at its lowest ever position?
And still at a very, very high level.
But low and going down at the moment.
Public services across the whole of the UK have had a very difficult time because of austerity largely imposed on Scotland by the UK government. Confidence in our health service, for example, in education, remains at very, very high levels. But we recognise, as First Minister, I recognise the big challenge there is. Take the health service, for example. We have rising demand because of changing demographics. So we are investing record sums in the health service. We have record numbers of people working in the health service.
We talked about the health service last year.
We have to carry out difficult reforms as well. Integration of health and social care, shifting more resource into primary care. That's all underway in Scotland. I would argue it's further advanced in Scotland, which is why we've got the best performing accident and emergency units of any part of the UK, and that's been the case for almost 4 years running.
We talked about A&E and targets this time last year. Since then, how often have you hit those targets?
We're not hitting targets consistently.
60 weeks in a row you failed to hit those
for example,
targets.
in the last couple of weeks, we've hit one of our cancer targets for the first time in a couple of years, which is good and positive. We've got another cancer target that we're working hard to hit. Just after this parliamentary recess, the new Health Secretary, Jean Freeman, will set out a very clear and funded plan to sustainably reduce waiting times so that we are meeting all of our targets. So we're doing the hard work that we need to do to make sure our fantastic health service continues to deliver.
Confidence in Scottish schools has never been lower. Is that related to the £400 million cut you made in schools' budgets since you came to power?
We're putting extra money into schools, so
after now, £400 million less?
Again, we've suffered from austerity. Last year, and this is a sharp contrast again to other parts of the UK, at local authority budgets, and it's local authorities that largely fund our schools. Local authority, I heard you ask Brandon Lewis about cuts to local authorities. We've had a real terms increase in the revenue budgets in local authorities in the last year. We're putting what we're calling the Pupil Equity Fund directly into schools in the hands of head teachers.
You've also, sorry to jump in.
Teacher numbers are rising
again. After 3,500 fewer teachers over your time as
partly due to the cuts to the Scottish budget, but also teacher numbers will change depending on the numbers of pupils in our school. But we've got more than 500 extra teachers in our schools. We're putting more money into schools. These are difficult challenges, but we're meeting these challenges head on.
If it's all down to UK-wide cuts and so on, Why is it that in reading, maths and science, probably the three subjects most important to Scotland's economic future, Scotland is way below England in the PISA rankings?
The PISA rankings, which are important, and the PISA study you cite is already getting to be a bit out of date. We've been doing a lot of work. All of the evidence we have now is that not only are standards rising, and we look at that in terms of exam passes, the gap between the richest and poorest students is closing. The gap between the richest and poorest...
But something's gone wrong, hasn't it?
Well, we're working hard to make sure that it's going right, and we will continue to do that. We've introduced standardised assessments in our schools now, which are opposed by many of all of the other parties, but we think that's important so that from the youngest age, we know and have confidence that our children are doing well, so that if there are issues there, we can intervene earlier.
We've talked inevitably in very abstract terms, but there's an anonymous teacher who wrote to you just this week, and she said, "I'm not sure of the extent to which you are aware of how bad things are. The Scottish Government are not tackling the real underlying issues in education, but just putting a plaster over a gaping wound. We have a teaching crisis. I do not think the current help goes anywhere near far enough." What do you say to her?
Well, we'll continue to talk to teachers and to work with teachers and with parents. We have not just a situation now where we're putting more investment into schools and we have teacher numbers rising again, but we are also carrying out important
She sounds pretty desperate.
Look, I've read that letter in full, not just the extract that you've read out there, so I know the issues that teacher has raised. Some of them are around mainstreaming in education, where pupils with additional support needs are in mainstream schools rather than special schools. But we're carrying out also important reforms of education, so giving head teachers more resources and also more power. So, you know, as we watch a UK government that seems to be paralysed by Brexit, we're getting on with these challenges. All governments everywhere face these challenges right now. We're getting on with them and finding the solutions, working with teachers in the health service, working with health professionals to overcome big challenges that we face.
You've had one huge distraction through all of this period, which is the position of Alex Salmond. You know him well, you keep your ear to the ground. Had you heard any stories about him before it broke in the press?
Of this nature, absolutely not. Until, well, I've said previously, Alex Salmond informed me about these complaints in April. That was the first I had known. Look, I would say two things you will appreciate, and this is not me trying to dodge the answer. There are legal processes underway. I'm very limited in what I can say, which is frustrating, believe me. It's very important, and I heard you talk earlier on about the situation in America with the Supreme Court confirmation. It's important when complaints of this nature come forward, they are properly investigated, and that happens no matter how uncomfortable it is for people like me, what the identity or political affiliation of the person complained about is, that there is proper investigation and due process for all parties, and that's what has to happen here.
Would you welcome him back if he's...
But I'm not... Alec is somebody that I have not just worked with, he's been a friend of mine for a long time, but it would not be right for me to preempt both the civil, legal
I'm going to ask you one more thing,
situation.
and you can give me the same answer, but he's raised a lot of money in crowdfunding to defend himself, £100,000, and Scottish Rape Crisis Centre have said this is inappropriate and sending the wrong message to women.
Look, I do think it's important, and I agree with Rape Crisis and other organisations that we must do nothing that makes it harder for women or anybody to come forward with these complaints. And I think there is a duty on all of us in how we respond to these things to make sure we're not doing that.
Nicola Sturgeon, thanks very much for talking.